The candles in Lady Fenwick's drawing-room had burned low, yet nobody dared leave. Not while the Duke of Blackmere stood at the center of the room, with his jaw set like carved stone, refusing the third daughter of an earl in front of 40 witnesses.
"Your Grace,"
the girl's mother had said only moments earlier, her voice trembling with rehearsed hope.
"My Arabella plays the pianoforte beautifully. She has been taught by the finest masters in London."
Sebastian Hawthorne, the 7th Duke of Blackmere, had merely inclined his head. "I am certain she has, madam, but I find I have no interest in marrying a pianoforte." A ripple of scandalized laughter passed through the room, quickly smothered behind fans and gloved hands. This was the 4th young lady he had turned away that season alone. The gossips of London had already given him a name behind his back, the Ruthless Duke. Handsome as sin, wealthy beyond counting, and colder than the Thames in January. Nobody in that drawing-room was prepared for what came next. Sebastian set down his untouched glass of claret and turned toward the doorway that led to the servants' passage, where a young woman stood with a silver tray balanced against her hip, waiting to be summoned to refill the refreshments. She wore a plain gray dress, her dark hair pinned back without a single ornament, her hands reddened from work that had nothing to do with drawing rooms or dance cards. "Emma," he said. The room fell silent enough to hear the mantel clock ticking. Emma Whitby froze. She had served in the Duke's household for nearly 3 years, carrying trays and mending linens and curtsying at doorways, and in all that time His Grace had spoken perhaps a dozen words to her. She looked up now, certain she had misheard her own name in a room full of noblewomen who actually mattered. "Your Grace?" she managed. "Come here, if you please." She should have refused. A housemaid did not walk across a drawing-room full of the ton while its finest ladies stared at her as though she had crawled in through the coal chute. But something in his voice, steady, unbothered, entirely certain, pulled her forward before her better sense could stop her feet. She stopped a respectful distance from him, tray still clutched in both hands, knuckles white. "Put that down, Emma," he said gently. "You will not need it."
"My lord, I don't understand."
"I intend to marry you." The tray slipped. Silver clattered against the polished floor, a teacup shattering into 3 pieces, and still the room made no sound louder than that single crash, because every person present was too stunned to breathe.
"Sebastian."
Lady Fenwick had gone the color of curdled milk.
"Surely you cannot mean she is a servant?"
"I am aware of what she is," Sebastian said, his voice never rising, never wavering. "I am also aware of what she is not, which is any of the women in this room who have spent the last hour informing me of their accomplishments as though I were purchasing a horse at Tattersall's." A gentleman near the fireplace made a strangled sound into his handkerchief. 2 matrons turned as pale as their pearls. The Earl's daughter, who had just been refused, looked as though she might faint from either humiliation or fury, and possibly both. Emma stood frozen in the center of it all, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she feared the entire room could hear it. She searched his face for some sign of jest, some flicker that would tell her this was a cruel trick being played at her expense. Dukes did not marry housemaids, not in London, not anywhere in England, not ever, and certainly not the Duke of Blackmere, who had rejected duchesses and diamonds of the first water without a flicker of regret. But there was no jest in his eyes, only a strange, quiet certainty, as though he had made this decision long before he had ever walked into Lady Fenwick's drawing-room tonight. "This is madness," someone whispered near the window. "It is decided," Sebastian answered, loud enough for the whole room, though his eyes had not left Emma's face. "I shall send my solicitor to obtain a special license within the week. Emma Whitby will be the next Duchess of Blackmere." Guests began to withdraw almost immediately, murmuring behind their fans, calling for their carriages before propriety had even permitted them a graceful exit. Within a quarter of an hour, the drawing room that had been full of London's most celebrated families stood nearly empty, littered with abandoned refreshments and the shards of a broken teacup nobody had thought to sweep away. Emma remained rooted to the spot, staring at the man who had just upended her entire existence with 11 words. "Why?" she whispered, when at last only the two of them and a stunned footman remained. "Why would you do such a thing?" Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Grief, perhaps, or memory, or a promise so old it had nearly turned to dust. "Someday," he said quietly, "I will tell you everything. Tonight, only know that this was never a whim, Emma. I have waited a very long time to say those words to you." He offered her his arm to escort her to the carriage, and though every instinct told her to refuse, to run back to the servants' quarters where the world still made sense, Emma found she could not move her feet away from him. Whatever secret lay behind his sudden declaration, she was about to become the most talked-about woman in all of England, and she did not even know why. Blackmere Hall rose out of the Yorkshire fog like something carved from memory itself, its grey stone towers older than the dukedom that bore its name. Emma had lived within its walls for years as a servant, scrubbing its floors and polishing its silver, but riding through its front gates in a ducal carriage felt like arriving at a house she had never seen before. She said little on the journey north. Sebastian said even less. He watched the moors roll past the carriage window with an expression she could not read, his fingers tapping once against his knee before stilling again, as though he were rehearsing words he had not yet found the courage to speak. That evening, once Emma had been shown to a guest chamber far grander than the narrow servants' room she once called her own, Sebastian sought out the one person in the household he trusted with the truth. Old Mr. Pargeter had served as butler to the Hawthorne family for nearly 40 years. He had known Sebastian as a boy in short breeches, long before the title and its burdens had settled on his shoulders. He found the Duke standing before the library fire, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. "You have given the whole of London something to talk about for a decade, Your Grace," Pargeter said quietly, closing the door behind him. "Let them talk." Sebastian did not turn from the fire. "They have never understood the debt I owe that family, and I do not intend to explain myself to Lady Fenwick's drawing room." "Then explain it to me, if you will permit an old man his curiosity. I have wondered for 15 years why you kept such careful watch over that child." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "You remember the winter I was young. My father sent me north with Captain Whitby to collect papers from our solicitor in Ripon. The roads across the moor were never safe after dark, and that year they were worse than most." "I remember it well enough," Pargeter said. "You returned with a fever and half your escort missing. Highwaymen fell upon our carriage 2 miles from the nearest coaching inn. Captain Whitby fought them off long enough for the driver to get me clear, but he took a ball meant for me in the process. We carried him into the inn, and he did not last the night." Pargeter's face softened with old sorrow. "I recall the funeral. Your father wept, which I had never seen him do before nor since. Before he died," Sebastian continued, his voice roughening, "Captain Whitby asked only one thing of me. He had a daughter, barely 5 years old, with no mother living and no family left to claim her. He asked that I see her cared for, that she never want for anything, that she never be abandoned to the workhouse or worse." "And so you brought her into your household?" "Quietly, and without ever telling her why. I paid for her schooling under a false name through the parish. When she came of age to work, I arranged for her to be placed here, at Blackmere, where I could see to her welfare myself without anyone suspecting the truth of it. Sebastian finally turned from the fire. I have watched her grow into a woman of more grace and goodness than every noblewoman who has ever curtsied to me in a ballroom, Pajita. And somewhere along the way, the promise I made to a dying man became something else entirely. You love her? I have loved her for longer than I dare admit, even to myself. But she believes she is a servant who has caught the notice of her master by some strange accident of fate. She does not know her father died a hero. She does not know I have shaped the whole of her life from the shadows for 15 years. He set the brandy down, untouched. I fear what she will feel when she learns the truth of it. Gratitude, perhaps, Pargeter offered. Gratitude is not what I want from her. Sebastian's jaw tightened. A woman does not marry out of gratitude, Pargeter. She endures it. I would rather she hated me for a fool than loved me only because she felt she owed me her life. Then why announce the marriage before she knows any of this? Because I have waited 15 years to do right by that man's daughter, and every day I delayed only made the secret heavier. I could not court her properly without the whole of society demanding to know why a duke would look twice at a housemaid. A declaration silences questions that a courtship would only invite. Sebastian moved to the window, looking out over the dark moor where a man had once died in the mud for his sake. I mean to tell her everything in time, but I would have her know my heart before she learns of my debt, so that when the truth comes, she cannot mistake one for the other. Pargeter said nothing for a moment, watching the young man he had known for years carry a burden few dukes would ever have troubled themselves to shoulder. She is a fortunate young woman, Your Grace, whether she understands it yet or not. Fortunate, Sebastian repeated softly, is not the word I would choose. I owe her father my life. What I feel for Emma now has grown well beyond repayment of that debt, and it terrifies me more than any highwayman ever could. Outside, the wind rose over the moor, carrying with it the same cold silence that had swallowed Captain Whitby 15 years before. And somewhere above them, in a chamber she barely recognized as her own, Emma Whitby lay awake, wondering what secret could possibly explain a duke's sudden, unshakable devotion to a girl who scrubbed his floors. News of the engagement reached the servants' hall at Blackmere before the sun had properly risen. Emma heard it in fragments as she passed through the corridors. A scullery maid's sharp intake of breath, a footman's low whistle quickly swallowed, the housekeeper's voice dropping to a whisper the moment she noticed Emma near the stairs. By breakfast, the household had split itself into two unspoken camps. Mrs. Thistlewood, who had trained Emma in her first months at the hall, embraced her the moment they were alone in the linen room, tears standing in her eyes. I always said there was something fine about you, girl. Didn't I say it more than once? But not everyone shared her joy. Sarah, one of the upper housemaids who had long hoped to catch the eye of the Duke's steward, would not so much as look at Emma across the kitchen table. Some folk climb through hard work, she said to no one in particular, loud enough to be heard. And some folk climb through flattering the master until he can't see straight. Emma said nothing in her own defense. What could she say? She had wondered the very same thing herself in the dark hours of the night, turning Sebastian's declaration over and over as though it were a coin she could not tell was counterfeit or true. On Sunday, she walked to the small stone parish church beside Mrs. Thistlewood, dressed in a gown finer than anything she had ever owned, though it still felt borrowed, as though at any moment someone might notice the mistake and strip it from her shoulders. The congregation turned as she entered. Farmers' wives who had once nodded to her kindly in the market now studied her with open curiosity, whispering behind gloved hands the same way the ladies in London had done. A gentleman's daughter she recognized, the vicar's own niece, curtsied to her with such exaggerated formality that it could only have been mockery dressed as courtesy. Emma kept her eyes fixed upon the altar throughout the service, though she heard little of the sermon. She was aware, painfully aware, of every eye upon her, of every quiet word passed from pew to pew. After the service, she slipped away from the churchyard gathering and walked alone to the small corner of the burial ground where her father lay. The stone was simple, weathered by 15 winters, bearing only his name and the years of his birth and death. She knelt in the damp grass and pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, the way she had done every Sunday since she was old enough to walk there herself.
"I don't understand any of it, Papa,"
she whispered.
"A duke wishes to marry me, and I cannot fathom why. The whole village believes I have bewitched him, or worse, that I have schemed for it. I have done nothing but serve tea and mend linens these 3 years past. Why would a man such as he choose someone such as me?"
The wind answered with nothing but the rustle of yew branches overhead. She was still kneeling there when she heard footsteps behind her on the gravel path. She did not need to turn to know who it was. She had learned the particular weight of his stride these past days, unhurried, careful, as though he feared startling her. "I did not mean to intrude," Sebastian said.
"You are the Duke, Your Grace. You may go wherever you please."
Her voice came out sharper than she intended, and she softened it at once, ashamed.
"Forgive me, I did not mean—"
"You need not apologize to me, Emma. Not ever." He stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. "I only wish to see that you were well. The village can be unkind in its curiosity."
"They believe I have trapped you somehow, that I flattered you, or worse."
She looked up at him, searching his face for the truth she still could not grasp.
"Tell me plainly, Your Grace, why have you chosen me? I am no fool. I know what I am, and I know what you are, and the distance between the two is not something affection alone can close."
Sebastian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might finally speak the truth he carried. But something held him back. Perhaps fear of how she would receive it. Perhaps simple cowardice, though she could hardly imagine that word applied to a man who had faced down half the aristocracy without blinking. "I have my reasons," he said at last, "and I promise you shall know them fully, in time. For now, I ask only that you trust I have not acted from pity, nor from any cruel amusement at your expense. Whatever else you believe of me, believe that."
"Trust is not so easily given, Your Grace. Not when I do not understand the ground I am standing upon."
"Then I shall have to earn it," he said quietly, "however long that may take." He offered his arm to walk her back toward the hall, and though she hesitated, the cold from the grass had begun to seep into her knees, and the churchyard held no more answers than it ever had. She rose and let him lead her away, though her heart remained unsettled. Behind them, the wind stirred the wildflowers someone had left upon Captain Whitby's grave that morning, fresh and unexplained, though Emma had not noticed them until she was too far down the path to turn back and ask who among the household had thought to bring them. Bath, in the height of its season, was a city of polished stone and painted fans, where reputations could be built or ruined over the course of a single evening at the assembly rooms. Sebastian had business with his solicitor regarding certain estate matters, and rather than leave Emma behind at Blackmere to endure the village's stares alone, he brought her south with him, hoping the change of scenery might ease the tension that had settled over her these past weeks. It did not. The moment their carriage drew up before the assembly rooms, Emma understood that London's gossip had travelled faster than they had. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. A young man near the entrance elbowed his companion and nodded toward her with a smirk he did not trouble to hide. Inside, beneath the great chandeliers, Emma kept close to Sebastian's side as introductions were made, curtsies exchanged, all the correct words spoken in all the correct order. It was Lady Beatrice Calloway who broke the pretense of civility. She was a striking woman, elegantly dressed, with a smile that never once reached her eyes. Her daughter, Miss Charlotte Calloway, had been among the young ladies Sebastian had refused only months before, and Lady Beatrice had not forgotten the insult. "How delightful," she said, approaching with a rustle of silk. "To finally meet the young woman who has caused such a stir. Tell me, Miss Whitby, was it difficult, learning to curtsy properly? I understand such things take years of practice that a housemaid rarely has occasion to acquire." "I manage well enough, my lady," Emma answered evenly, though her cheeks burned.
How resourceful of you.
Lady Beatrice's smile sharpened. "I do hope His Grace has considered how such a match might reflect upon his standing. A duke's wife is expected to entertain foreign dignitaries, to know the correct order of precedence at a state dinner, to converse in French without embarrassing herself. Have you had occasion to learn French, Miss Whitby, between scrubbing floors and polishing silver?" Sebastian's hand tightened at his side, but Emma spoke before he could intervene. "I have not had the privilege of a French tutor, my lady, no, though I confess I find honest work a poor thing to be ashamed of." A few of the surrounding guests exchanged glances, some clearly impressed by her composure, though Lady Beatrice's expression only cooled further before she withdrew with a final, thin smile. The true blow came 3 days later.
Sebastian had gone to meet his solicitor when word reached Emma that a letter was circulating among the fashionable households of Bath, copied and passed from hand to hand at every card party and breakfast gathering. She did not see it herself until Mrs. Thistlewood, who had accompanied her south, brought her a copy with trembling hands, and an apology already forming on her lips. The letter, written in an elegant hand and signed only with initials, claimed that Emma Whitby had accepted money from more than one gentleman in London before ever catching the Duke's notice, that her modest reputation was nothing more than a carefully maintained fiction, and that the Duke of Blackmere had been thoroughly deceived by a woman more calculating than her humble appearance suggested. Emma read it twice before the paper slipped from her fingers. "It's a lie," she whispered. "Every word of it is a lie." "Of course it is, my dear," Miss Thistlewood said, gathering her into an embrace.
"Anyone with sense can see it for the spite it is."
But sense, Emma had learned these past weeks, held little sway over the ton. Invitations that had arrived that very morning were withdrawn by afternoon. A hostess who had greeted her warmly the previous evening now sent word that her presence would no longer be required at an upcoming supper. By the time Sebastian returned from his solicitor's office, Emma sat alone in their rented rooms, the forged letter still crumpled in her lap, her eyes red-rimmed, though she had refused to let herself weep in front of the servants. Sebastian read the letter in silence, his face growing paler with each line, then colder, then still in a way Emma had not seen since the night he had refused Lady Fenwick's guests in front of the whole of London. "Who wrote this?" His voice was quiet, dangerously so.
"I don't know," Emma said. "I have never taken a shilling from any man in my life, Sebastian. You must believe me."
"I do not need to be convinced of your honesty, Emma. I have watched you for 3 years scrub floors until your hands bled, rather than take so much as an extra candle stub that wasn't owed you. Whoever wrote this knows nothing true about you at all." He folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside his coat. "But someone wished this scandal to reach every household in Bath before we could deny it. And that suggests a deliberate hand, not idle gossip."
"What will you do?"
"I intend to find out who authored this filth," he said, "and I intend to make certain they regret it thoroughly." He crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his own, ink-stained fingers and all. "I am sorry, Emma. I brought you into a world that has shown you nothing but cruelty since the moment I spoke your name aloud. and I promise you, this will not go unanswered."
Emma searched his face, still uncertain whether the growing storm around her was one she had any hope of surviving. But for the first time since the drawing room in London, she saw something in his eyes that steadied her more than any words could. Not pity, not duty, but the unmistakable fury of a man prepared to burn down every drawing room in England to protect her name. The cottage where Emma had spent her earliest years stood empty at the edge of Blackmere village, its thatch sagging, its garden long overgrown with nettles. The estate had arranged for its sale now that no family remained to claim it, and Emma had asked only that she be permitted to sort through what little remained of her father's belongings before strangers took possession of the walls that had once held her childhood. Sebastian had offered to accompany her, but Emma had asked instead for Mrs. Thistlewood's company, needing, for once, to face her father's memory without the weight of the Duke's presence beside her. She had not forgotten the forged letter, nor the question it had planted in her mind like a splinter she could not draw out. What did she truly know of the man she was to marry, beyond his sudden and unexplained devotion? The cottage held little of value: a worn Bible, a few pieces of chipped crockery, a moth-eaten greatcoat that still, faintly, carried the memory of tobacco and horse leather. It was in the small back room, beneath a loose floorboard her father had once shown her as a child in jest, that Emma found the old campaign chest. It had belonged to her father's years in the cavalry, its brass fittings tarnished green, its leather straps cracked and stiff. Inside lay a folded uniform, a tarnished medal, and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, the paper gone soft and yellow with age.
"Ma'am,"
Mrs. Thistlewood said gently,
"perhaps this is a task best left for another day." "No!"
Emma's hands trembled as she lifted the bundle free.
"I have waited 15 years to know more of my father than a handful of memories too faint to trust. I will not turn away from this now."
The letters were correspondence between her father and a man who signed himself only as H, written in the years before Emma was born, when both men had apparently served together and remained close afterward. Most spoke of ordinary matters: crops, weather, the health of a mutual friend's horse. But it was the final letter in the bundle, unfinished, the ink trailing off mid-sentence as though the writer had been interrupted and never returned to complete it, that stopped Emma's breath entirely. "Thomas, you need not thank me further for what small assistance I have given the child's education. It is little enough beside what your family is owed."
"I have spoken to my son of the promise, though he is yet too young to understand its full weight. When the time comes, I shall see that he honors it, whatever it may cost the estate. You gave everything that winter on the moor, and I mean to see your daughter never once for—" The letter ended there. Emma read it 3 times before the meaning settled over her like cold water.
"Mrs. Thistlewood," she said quietly, "who is H? Do you know?"
The older woman's face had gone carefully blank in a way that told Emma she knew a great deal more than she wished to admit. "That would be old His Grace, ma'am. The 7th Duke's father, God rest him." Emma sat very still amid the dust and the scattered letters, pieces of a puzzle she had not known existed suddenly falling into place with terrible clarity. Her father had known the old Duke. Her education, quietly funded through the parish for reasons no one had ever explained.
Her placement at Blackmere Hall, arranged so easily when other households would have turned away a girl with no family name to recommend her. Every kindness she had received since childhood, every door that had opened when it ought to have stayed closed.
"There was a promise," Emma whispered. "My father did something for that family, something they believed themselves in debt for, and every act of charity I ever received was payment against that debt. Sebastian did not choose me at all. He is merely settling an old account."
"Ma'am, I don't believe—"
"What else could it mean?"
Emma's voice cracked.
He said he had waited a long time to marry me. He said this was never a whim. I thought, foolishly, I thought it meant something of the heart. But it was never about me at all, was it? It was a debt passed down from father to son, and I am simply the sum owed.
She travelled to York the following day with the family solicitor, a careful, grey-haired man named Mr. Ferris, who had handled her father's modest affairs since his death. In the solicitor's cramped office above a bookseller's shop, Emma finally learned the whole of it. How Captain Thomas Whitby had died on a moor road 15 years past, shielding a young boy from highwaymen's bullets, and how that boy had grown into the Duke of Blackmere, quietly discharging a debt he believed too great to speak of aloud. "Your father was a hero, Miss Whitby," Mr. Ferris said gently, sliding a faded record across the desk toward her. "The old Duke wrote to me himself years ago, arranging your school fees under a name that would not draw attention. His son has continued the arrangement faithfully ever since." Emma stared at the paper without truly seeing it, her father's sacrifice laid bare in dry legal language, and somewhere beneath the grief of learning how he had died, a colder, harder feeling took root. Not gratitude, but heartbreak, sharp and complete, at the realization that the man she had begun, foolishly, to love, had perhaps never loved her at all, only the memory of a debt he could not bear to leave unpaid. Emma left Blackmere Hall 3 days after her return from York, taking nothing but a single trunk and a note left for Mrs. Thistlewood, asking that no one trouble themselves to follow her. She travelled west into Westmoreland, to the cottage of Mrs. Agnes Colby, an elderly widow who had once served as her mother's own maid before Emma had even been born, and who had written to her faithfully every Christmas since Emma was old enough to read. The Lake District in early autumn was a country of soft grey water and low mist, the fells rising quietly behind curtains of fog that never quite lifted before noon. Emma found a strange comfort in it, in the silence of a place that asked nothing of her, made no demands upon her name or her gratitude, required no curtsy she did not wish to give. She had been there 8 days when Sebastian arrived. He came without his carriage crest displayed, without servants beyond a single groom left waiting at the village inn, and when Mrs. Colby answered her door to find a duke standing on her threshold in a plain travelling coat, mud-splattered to the knee, she very nearly refused to let him in at all.
"She does not wish to see you, your grace," the old woman said, though not unkindly.
"She has told me as much herself." "I would not blame her," Sebastian said, "but I have travelled a great distance to say what I ought to have said months ago, and I mean to say it whether she wishes to hear it from her doorstep or not." Emma heard the exchange from the small back room, and, against every instinct urging her to remain hidden, found herself walking toward the door instead.
"Let him in, Mrs. Colby," she said quietly. "I have questions of my own that deserve an answer."
They walked together along the lakeshore that afternoon, the water pewter-colored beneath low cloud, neither speaking until they had gone some distance from the cottage and its curious, watchful windows.
"I know everything now,"
Emma said finally.
"I found my father's letters. I spoke with Mr. Ferris in York. I know what my father did for you on that moor. And I know your father made you a promise to see me cared for. And I know you have kept that promise faithfully for 15 years without ever once telling me the truth of it."
"I meant to tell you," Sebastian said. "I have wanted to tell you since the night I spoke your name in Lady Fenwick's drawing room."
"Then why did you not?"
"Because I feared exactly this." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I feared that once you knew, you would believe every kindness I had ever shown you was merely a debt being repaid, rather than what it became somewhere along the way."
"How am I meant to believe otherwise?"
"Sebastian, you funded my education before I was old enough to understand what an education was. You arranged my placement at Blackmere when a girl with no family name should have found every door closed to her. You have spent 15 years shaping my life from the shadows, and now you wish to marry me. Tell me plainly, if my father had lived, if there had been no promise, no debt owed, would you have ever once looked twice at a housemaid carrying your tea tray?" Sebastian did not answer at once, and his silence cut deeper than any word could have.
"You cannot answer," Emma said softly, "because you do not know. How could you? You have never once known me apart from the debt you owe my father's memory. Everything you feel for me is tangled up with grief and guilt. You call it love, Sebastian, but how would you ever tell the difference?"
I have asked myself that very question every night since I realized what I felt for you had changed, he admitted, his voice rough. I will not lie to you and claim the answer came easily. Gratitude toward your father and affection for you lived so long side by side in my heart that I could not always tell where one ended and the other began.
"Then you understand why I cannot simply take your word for it now."
I do understand it. He reached for her hand, and though every instinct told her to draw away, she let him take it. But I will tell you this, Emma. I have known a great many women since I came into my title. I have sat across from duchesses and diamonds of the first water, women trained from birth to charm a duke, and not one of them ever once made me feel the way I feel when you argue with me across a breakfast table, or when you tend to a sick tenant's without being asked, or when you look at me the way you are looking at me now, as though you expect me to disappoint you, and yet you have not given up hoping I won't.
"That is not an answer to my question."
No, he agreed quietly. It is not. Because I do not know what I would have felt had your father lived and there had been no promise between our families. I cannot answer a question about a life that never happened. All I can tell you is what I feel in this life, the one we are actually living. And that feeling has nothing left in it that resembles duty. Emma studied his face for a long moment, the mist rolling in off the lake behind him, and found she had no answer of her own to give, only a heart too bruised and too uncertain to trust what it wanted to believe.
"I need time, Sebastian," she said at last. "I cannot simply return to Blackmere as though none of this happened."
"Then I will wait," he said, "for as long as you require it. But I will not stop coming back to ask you the same question, Emma, until you finally believe the answer." She left him standing by the water's edge as she walked back toward Mrs. Colby's cottage, her heart no lighter than it had been that morning, though something in his words had lodged itself stubbornly beneath her doubt, refusing, for now, to be dislodged entirely. While Emma remained in Westmoreland, Sebastian rode north to Alnwick, where his investigation into the forged letter had finally uncovered a name worth pursuing. He had set his own steward, a sharp-eyed man named Grimshaw, who had once served as a Bow Street runner before entering the Duke's employ, to trace the letter's origin through the paper merchant who had supplied it and the hand that had penned it. Grimshaw met him at a coaching inn on the edge of the town, his coat still dusted from the road. "Your Grace, I believe I have found our author." He set a folded document on the table between them. The paper was purchased from a stationer in Bath who keeps careful account of his regular customers. Only one gentleman of quality bought that particular stock in the weeks before the letter began circulating. "Who?" "Mr. Edmund Calloway, Lady Beatrice's brother." Sebastian's expression darkened. "Her brother, not the lady herself." "I suspect she encouraged it readily enough, Your Grace, but the hand that wrote the letter was his own. I compared it against correspondence he sent to a horse breeder in Leeds. The similarities are unmistakable." "What reason would Edmund Calloway have to concern himself with my marriage at all? His sister's grievance I understand well enough, but a man does not forge scandal over a rejected niece's disappointment." "That, Your Grace, took rather longer to uncover." Grimshaw hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I made inquiries with your solicitor regarding recent changes to your will.
It seems word had reached Mr. Calloway that you intended to settle a portion of the estate directly upon Miss Whitby, independent of any marriage settlement, in the event anything should happen to you before the wedding took place. Sebastian went very still.
Only my solicitor and myself knew of that provision.
And, it would seem, a clerk in your solicitor's office who owed a considerable gambling debt to a man in Mr. Calloway's circle. The information was sold rather cheaply, Your Grace, for what it has cost you both.
So the forged letter was never truly about Emma's reputation at all.
Sebastian's voice had gone low and dangerous.
It was an attempt to end the engagement before any settlement could be finalized, so that his sister's daughter might still have hope of the match. Or failing that,
so the Calloway family might position themselves closer to whatever influence remained once the scandal ran its course. There is more, Your Grace, and I confess I do not know how you will receive it. Grimshaw drew a second paper from his coat, older, the ink faded with years rather than months. In tracing Mr. Calloway's affairs, I came across an old account from a magistrate's inquiry, some 15 years past, into a gang of highwaymen operating along the Yorkshire moor roads. The inquiry named a local informant suspected of supplying information on travelers' routes and schedules to the men responsible, though nothing was ever proven, and the matter was quietly dropped for lack of evidence.
Sebastian's hand tightened around the edge of the table. The moor road. The winter my father sent me to Ripon.
The same, Your Grace. The informant named in the inquiry was a young man employed at the time as a clerk to a Yorkshire landowner. His name was Edmund Calloway. For a long moment, Sebastian said nothing at all. 15 years fell away in an instant, and he was 12 years old again, huddled in an overturned carriage, while a man he loved as dearly as his own father bled out his final hours on the floor of a coaching inn. All because someone had known precisely which road they would travel, and precisely when. You are certain as old records and a magistrate's faded memory can make me, Your Grace. He cannot be charged with that crime after so many years, not without witnesses living to testify, and the inquiry itself was never conclusive. But the connection is there, plain enough for any sensible man to see it, should it ever be brought before the right ears. Sebastian rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out over the grey Northumberland rooftops without truly seeing them. The rage that rose in him was cold rather than hot, the kind that settled deep into the bone and stayed there.
He has cost that family everything twice over, he said quietly. Once on the moor, and now again in Bath. All to protect an inheritance he was never entitled to in the first place.
What would you have me do, Your Grace?
Gather every scrap of evidence you can find. The forged letter, the clerk who sold my private business, the old inquiry into the highwaymen. I want it laid before the right magistrates, and I want it laid before society at large, so that Edmund Calloway understands precisely what it costs a man to underestimate what he has provoked.
And Lady Beatrice?
Her brother's ruin will be punishment enough for a woman who valued her family's standing above every ounce of decency she was ever taught.
Sebastian turned from the window, something settling behind his eyes that Grimshaw had not seen since the night word first reached the estate of Captain Whitby's death.
Bring me everything, Grimshaw. I intend to see this finished before I return to Emma, so that when I ask her to come home, there will be nothing left standing between us but the truth. Word travelled through London that a gathering was to be held at a townhouse near Westminster, hosted by an earl who owed the Duke of Blackmere a considerable favour, and had agreed, without quite understanding why, to open his rooms to whatever business Sebastian wished to conduct. Peers arrived expecting an ordinary evening of cards and conversation. Bishops came out of respect for the earl's standing. Members of society who had spent months whispering about the Duke's scandalous engagement came, above all, out of curiosity, eager to witness whatever fresh humiliation the affair might yet produce. Emma had returned from Westmoreland only 2 days before, summoned by a letter from Sebastian that asked nothing of her except her presence, promising that whatever she witnessed that evening would answer every question she had carried since the campaign chest first opened beneath her hands.
She stood now at the edge of the crowded drawing room in a gown of deep blue silk, Mrs. Thistlewood close beside her, uncertain what she had agreed to walk into. Sebastian took his place at the center of the room, and the assembled guests fell quiet with the particular hush reserved for men who rarely spoke without cause. "Many of you have wondered," he began, "why I chose to marry a woman without fortune or family name to recommend her, when every eligible daughter of the ton stood ready to accept my hand. Tonight, I intend to satisfy your curiosity fully, though I suspect the answer will please rather fewer of you than expect it." He held up a folded document, and Emma recognized it at once as a copy of the old, unfinished letter she had found among her father's things. 15 years ago, on a moor road in Yorkshire, my carriage was set upon by highwaymen. I was 12 years old, traveling under the protection of a cavalry officer named Captain Thomas Whitby, who gave his life that night defending mine. Before he died, he asked only that his daughter, a girl of 5 years, never be abandoned to want or hardship. My father made that promise on my behalf, and upon his death, I inherited the obligation along with the title. A murmur passed through the room, guests exchanging glances, certain now that they understood the shape of the story about to unfold. A duke, bound by honor to a debt he could not shake, dutifully repaying a dead man's sacrifice with his own hand in marriage. "For 15 years I discharged that debt quietly," Sebastian continued. "I funded Miss Whitby's education. I arranged her placement within my own household, where I could see to her welfare without ever revealing the truth of why. I told myself for a great many years that I was simply a man of honor fulfilling his father's word." He paused, and Emma felt every eye in the room shift toward her, waiting for the confirmation they had already assumed. "You believe I am about to tell you that duty alone brought me to this marriage." Sebastian's voice hardened, and he tore the folded letter in half before the assembled crowd, the sound sharper in the silent room than it had any right to be. "You are wrong." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Even Emma, who had heard him plead his case beside a Westmoreland lake only weeks before, felt her breath catch at the sight of him destroying the very proof of the obligation he might have hidden behind for the rest of his life. "The debt I owed Captain Whitby's memory was settled the moment his daughter reached adulthood and no longer required my protection. Whatever I owed that family, I have paid in full, and tonight I release myself from it entirely, before every one of you as witness." He turned, and for the first time since he had begun speaking, his eyes found Emma across the crowded room, and his voice softened into something no longer meant for the assembly, but for her alone. "If Captain Whitby had lived a long and peaceful life, if there had never been a promise, if I had simply been a young duke who happened one day to notice a housemaid carrying tea across a drawing room, I would still have crossed the whole of England to ask for her hand. Because she is not a debt I am settling. She is the only person who has ever made Blackmere Hall feel like a home to me, rather than an inheritance I was born to carry." The room fell utterly silent. Emma stood frozen among the crowd, tears rising before she could stop them, the weight of months of doubt and grief and quiet heartbreak finally breaking apart within her chest. She had asked him, beside the lake, whether he would have chosen her without the promise, and he had told her honestly that he could not answer a question about a life that never happened. Now, before the whole of London, he had answered it anyway, in the only way that mattered, not with certainty about an impossible past, but with the plain, unguarded truth of what he felt in the present, freely given, owed to no one. She crossed the room without quite realizing she had moved, guests parting before her as though she were something newly precious rather than the servant girl they had mocked for months. Sebastian met her halfway, taking both her hands in his.
"I should have said this to you weeks ago," he murmured, "instead of leaving you to wonder."
"You said it exactly when it mattered most," Emma answered, her voice breaking. "Before everyone who ever doubted either of us."
Behind them, a bishop began, quietly, to applaud, and within moments the whole room followed, even those who had come that evening hoping to witness the Duke of Blackmere's final humiliation. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, Lady Beatrice Calloway slipped quietly toward the door, her brother's name already being murmured in connection with forged letters and old Moor Road inquiries, her family's standing crumbling as surely and as publicly as the paper Sebastian had torn apart before them all. The wedding took place at the small stone parish church at Blackmere 6 months later, on a bright morning in early spring when the moor had shed its winter gray for something softer, green pushing up through the heather in patches that caught the sunlight. There was no grand cathedral, no invitation list stretching across the whole of London society, though such things had been offered and quietly refused. "I would rather be married among the people who have known me since I was a girl carrying trays through that hall," Emma had told Sebastian, "than surrounded by strangers who spent months deciding whether I was worth their notice." Sebastian had agreed without hesitation, and so the church filled instead with estate workers who had watched Emma grow from a quiet servant into a woman they had come to respect. Tenant farmers whose families she had visited during the hard winter months, and a handful of gray-haired veterans who had once served alongside Captain Whitby and traveled from as far as Northumberland to see his daughter married. Mrs. Thistlewood wept openly through the entire ceremony, and Mrs. Colby had journeyed from Westmoreland especially for the occasion, seated proudly in the second pew as though she had personally arranged the whole affair. Emma wore a gown of pale ivory, simple in its design, with none of the elaborate ornamentation the Bath modistes had tried to press upon her. She had chosen instead to pin a small sprig of heather at her waist, cut that morning from the moor itself, close to the spot where her father had once given his life. The village bells rang long after the ceremony ended, and the wedding breakfast that followed was held not in some grand assembly room, but on the lawns of Blackmere Hall itself, tables set beneath the old oaks for anyone who wished to come, servant and gentry alike sharing the same bread and the same joy, without distinction of rank, for one single, unguarded afternoon. The transformation of the household did not end with the wedding vows. As Duchess of Blackmere, Emma turned her attention almost immediately to matters the previous generations of the family had rarely troubled themselves with. She established a small school in the village, insisting that every tenant's child, regardless of their family's standing, be taught to read and write and cipher sums, remembering too well her own uncertain path toward an education she had never understood the reason for. She oversaw improvements to the cottages scattered across the estate, cold and poorly kept for decades, ensuring proper roofs and dry floors for families who had endured Yorkshire winters without complaint for far too long. She visited the sick herself, sat with widows whose husbands had worked the land, and remembered every servant's name and every child's birthday with a warmth that no amount of noble breeding could have taught her, because it had never needed teaching in the first place. Word of the new Duchess spread slowly at first, then with growing admiration through the very circles that had once mocked her. Hostesses who had withdrawn their invitations in Bath now wrote seeking her acquaintance. Lady Beatrice Calloway had retreated entirely from society following her brother's public disgrace, his connection to the old Moor Road inquiry and the forged letter both laid bare before the magistrates, his standing destroyed beyond any hope of quiet repair. Those who had once called Emma a scheming servant now spoke instead of the Duchess of Blackmere's uncommon kindness, her humility, her genuine care for those beneath her notice, until the very families who had shunned her began, with quiet embarrassment, to admit they had misjudged her entirely. Sebastian watched the change with a private, unshakable pride, though he never once claimed credit for it.
"I did not make her what she is," he told Pargeter one evening, the old butler having long since become something closer to family than servant. "I only had the good fortune to recognize it, before anyone else troubled themselves to look." On a quiet autumn afternoon, some months into their marriage, Sebastian and Emma walked together to the small churchyard where Captain Whitby had been laid to rest 15 years before. The stone had been replaced since Emma's girlhood visits, a finer marker commissioned by Sebastian himself, though the inscription remained simple, honoring a soldier's courage rather than dwelling upon the grandeur his sacrifice had eventually brought about. Emma knelt, as she always did, pressing her palm against the cool stone, though her hand no longer trembled with the old uncertainty that had once accompanied every visit.
"I used to come here wondering why fate had placed such a strange and heavy destiny upon me," she said softly. "I understand it now, I think. Not as a debt and not as duty, but as the simple truth that one man's sacrifice on a cold winter road became, in the end, the beginning of everything good that followed." Sebastian knelt beside her, resting his hand over hers upon the stone. "I kept my promise to your father," he said quietly, "though it took me far too long to understand that keeping it was never the true reason I stayed beside you. Somewhere between the debt I owed and the woman you became, love found me without my ever noticing its arrival, and I have not looked back since." The wind moved gently through the churchyard yews, carrying with it none of the cold uncertainty that had haunted this same ground months before, only the quiet peace of a promise, finally, fully understood, not as an obligation carried reluctantly across 15 long years, but as the first quiet step toward a love that had, in the end, chosen itself.